Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad to be here with all of you. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We're going to have yet another late night conversation. It's going to be good. I'm looking forward to it. So, yeah, let's have another late night chat. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it.
American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. I am so glad to be here with all of you tonight. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. And, we had a great chat this afternoon. Go back and watch it if you had a chance. Talked a lot about how the crisis in Gaza is connected to the crisis in your neighborhood. Answered some good questions. It was a great chat, but we're doing twice a day now. So it's 10 p.m. It's actually 10:03 Eastern Standard Time. I'm here and I'm ready to chat with all of you. So it should be yet another great late night conversation. So the way this tends to work, the way it works generally, is if you have something you would like me to talk about in the second half of our show, if there's something you would like me to discuss in the second half of our show, send me a super chat. Send me a Rumble rant, send me a Rockfin tip, send me a super chat, and in the second half of the show, I will respond to it, answer it, whatever you ask. That's the way this tends to work. Is I give my opening remarks, then we do the roll call where I call you all out as I see you, names and locations. We find out who is on the other side of the camera. And then from there, we do the roll call. Then from there, we do the answering of questions for the rest of the night. So if you got something you want me to talk about, second half of our program, that's when it'll be answered. Send a Rumble rant, Rockfin tip, super chat. That's the way this works. Now, folks, I'm going to talk about some history tonight in my opening remarks. And this history I'm going to talk about is important because it's very relevant to what is going on in our time. And it's important also because I hear so many people getting it wrong. I hear so many people misusing these terms, etc. I want to talk to you all about the neocons and the neoconservatives and who they are and where they came from. And I'm also going to talk to you about what we talk about on here, this recurring theme of the synthetic left that we talk about. I'm going to talk about how these two trends in American politics are kind of intertwined, the synthetic left and the neoconservatives. And I'm going to try and clarify what these terms mean. For example, I hear so many mistakes in regards to these terms. People don't know what they're talking about when they talk about neoconservatives, when they talk about leftism, when they talk about woke, when they talk about all these different things. They don't know what they're talking about. I hear frequent mistakes. One mistake that I heard This is a mistake I heard from RFK. RFK was doing an interview, and in his interview, he said that that Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, the head of the Anti-Communist Studies Center at Columbia University, the guy who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan, he said that Zbigniew Brzezinski was a, quote, neoconservative. That's not accurate. That is simply not accurate. Zbigniew Brzezinski was a Cold War liberal. He was an advocate of soft power. He was an advocate of color revolutions. He was somewhat more critical of Israel. He actually advised Barack Obama in how to deal with it being publicized that a member of his staff had praised the Mearsheimer and Walt book on the Israel lobby. Brzezinski worked extensively to build ties between the Muslim world and the United States to use the Muslim world against the Soviet Union. Brzezinski was not a neoconservative. He was an anti-communist. He was an architect of a lot of the late Cold War strategies that the U.S. government engaged in. But the fact is, there is a group of people that are considered to be the neocons or the neoconservatives, and Brzezinski was not one of them. Brzezinski was a Cold War liberal. Brzezinski was a soft power geopolitical strategist. He wasn't a neocon. The other thing that I frequently hear, and this is the other mistake I frequently hear, is people talk about neoconservatives, and then they refer to moderate Democrats who oppose them as being neoliberals. And this is wrong as well. Neoliberalism refers to economic theory. It refers to privatizations of public services. It refers to the government having a more hands-off approach to the economy. Neoliberal economics was primarily championed by conservatives. Neoliberal economics is the economic theories of Milton Friedman, the economic theories of the Montpellier Society, Friedrich von Hayek, Alan Greenspan. Neoliberalism is an economic term. Neoconservatism is a political term. And so I frequently hear these mistakes. People say Brzezinski was a neocon. He was not. People say neoliberals and neoconservatives. That's not a correct understanding of these things. So tonight on this stream, I'm going to break down for you where the synthetic left came from, and also where the neoconservatives came from. And these things are not simple, right? In Marxism, they talk about how everything contains the seeds of its own destruction. They talk about the negation of the negation and how things turn into their opposite over time. If you read Hegel and Hegelian theories of history, everything is connected with everything else. Where do you start the story? There's a joke. I believe it was Zhou Enlai. In the 1960s, the foreign minister of China, Zhou Enlai, they asked him, what do you think has been the impact of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too soon to tell. People find that to be a very clever phrase, right? He's saying this in the 1960s about events in the 1790s. What has been the impact of the French Revolution? He said, it's too soon to tell. Well, that's true, right? When you're thinking about things from a Marxist perspective, when you're thinking about the trajectory of history and all the different contradictory forces that all add up into one event, you're often talking about so many different factors. You really can't start the story anywhere. The story has to start with the origin of time, with the origin of being, because everything is connected with everything else. You can't really start the story anywhere. So I'm going back pretty far. People didn't start talking about neocons until the 1980s. What we call the synthetic left really didn't get going and really didn't gain any ground until at least the early 60s. And even then, it was not exactly what it is. Really, what we see now in the last decade, in the last 10 years is really what I call the synthetic left, but its roots are in the early 60s. But in order to understand the synthetic left, in order to understand the neocons, you have to understand the Russian Revolution. All right? Again, we're going pretty far back, but that's okay. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was led by a party called the Bolsheviks. And the leader of the Bolsheviks was a guy named Vladimir Lenin. And the Bolsheviks were a group that was highly disciplined. They had a manner of organizing called democratic centralism. Party members were required to give the whole of their lives to the revolution. They were required to carry out orders and obey party discipline, whether they agreed or not. They were required to keep disagreements they might have with the party internal, so that publicly they had one united face to the masses. Democratic centralism was the way Lenin organized his party of new type in order to take power. And many people have pointed out that within the Bolsheviks, there seemed to be two types of members. The majority of the membership in the Bolshevik Party were labor union organizers. People who worked in factories, people who were involved in strikes and protests, would meet other people that were involved in labor unions and strikes and protests who would invite them to join the Bolshevik Party. And that was the strategy that the Bolsheviks laid out, is they wanted to recruit the most militant members of the labor movement. They wanted to find the agitators, the people who were leaders in the workplace, the people who stirred up their fellow workers to a confrontation with the boss. And the bulk of the Bolshevik Party, which I believe at the time of the Russian Revolution, they had something like 25,000 members. The bulk of the Bolshevik Party were labor union organizers, guys who worked in factories, guys who were involved in labor unions. That was the bulk of the Bolshevik Party. However, the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, Lenin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Litvinov, Bukharin, these people were very different. These people were wealthy. They were from wealthy backgrounds. They had family that owned businesses or family that were from the old aristocracy. And they were middle-class radicals. And a lot of them did not live much of their life in Russia. They had to flee the country because of persecution, because they were always going around and talking openly as communists. They had to flee the country, a lot of them. And they lived in Vienna, they lived in Berlin, they lived in Paris, they lived in New York City. And these were the people that tended to develop the strategy that the Bolshevik Party carried out. And Lenin was living in Switzerland at the time that the February Revolution happened. And then, with the help of German intelligence, he got on a train and he went back to Russia, and he swiftly had the Bolsheviks change their tactics and policies so that they could move toward eventually taking power. But the Bolshevik Party had two ranks, more or less. It had one layer of intellectuals, middle-class radicals. It had another layer of factory workers and labor organizers. And there were some peasants, too. It was primarily factory workers. And the Bolshevik Party had two newspapers, two publications. And these two publications both reflected the different layers. One publication was a theoretical journal called Iskra, which means spark. And it was edited by Bukharin, I believe. And it was articles that laid out Marxist theories about what imperialism is, Marxist theories about the way revolutionary tactics should be organized. It was a theoretical journal that was written for and distributed among the middle-class radicals. And then they had another publication that was a daily newspaper that was called Pravda, which means the truth. And Pravda didn't even say it was communist on it. People didn't even know it was a communist newspaper, but it was distributed widely to factory workers. And it was called The Truth. And it was mainly letters that workers wrote about the conditions in their factory, about not wanting to fight in World War I, about their rights being taken away, about their freedom of speech being taken away, etc. About police brutality, about issues that they faced. And the Bolsheviks did this on purpose. This wasn't an accident. Lenin, in his book, What is to be Done, he laid out that the activities of his party of new type were agitation and propaganda. Propaganda is teaching Marxist ideas, and he argued that propaganda should be reserved for the advanced. Propaganda is only for those that are considered to be dedicated enough and sophisticated politically enough to actually understand the very complicated Marxist ideology. Whereas agitation is for everybody. Agitation is not complicated at all. It's very simple. It's stirring people up to have a greater confrontation. If you're mad about your conditions in your workplace, you're mad about your lack of freedom of speech, you're mad about fighting in World War I, you open the Pravda, you open the truth, and you read about how unfair it was, and that stirred you up to go fight. That's agitation. And then, for a small minority of people who were considered to be people that were involved in the struggle enough that they were fit to be members of the Bolshevik Party, they had this theoretical magazine called Iskra that would teach you Marxist ideology, dialectical materialist philosophy, etc. And the Bolshevik Party had this contradictory aspect in it. On the one hand, it was a party of workers, factory workers, labor union organized. On the other hand, it was a party of middle-class radicals. And there are two individuals who incarnated these two trends. Lenin, and the brilliance of Lenin was that he understood that you needed both. And that's what his whole book, What is to be Done, is really about. He's saying, how can we take all these radical intellectuals who believe in communism and get them to organize a mass movement of factory workers to seize power? Lenin understood you needed both. And he said we have to agitate and we have to propagate. And he said we have to have democratic centralism to combine the strength of all of our leaders. We have to, he critiqued bowing to spontaneity. He opposed terrorism. You read it, Lenin's brilliance was that he understood you needed both. There are two individuals within the Bolshevik Party who represented these two trends. And one of them was a longtime enemy of the Bolsheviks who did not join the Bolshevik Party until July of 1917. And that guy's name was Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was from a Jewish family in Ukraine. He experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. He adopted Marxism as his philosophy, and he was very famous. He was a very, very good orator and a very, very good speaker. And he was known all over the Western world as the famous Russian Marxist writer. And he was a very good speaker and a very good orator. And he actually lived in New York City at the time that the Russian Revolution broke out. And he was the editor of a newspaper called Novy Mir. And Novy Mir, right? You're on the list. Novy Mir means new peace or new world. It was a socialist newspaper for Russian speakers in New York City. And he could speak English and he could speak German and he could speak French. And he was just this very, very charismatic speaker and writer. There had been an uprising in Russia in 1905, and they'd elected him the head of the Petrograd Soviet, and he'd been this great orator. And Trotsky was this well-known middle-class intellectual, and he hated the Russian peasantry. He thought that the peasantry were a backward class, He said the goal of the peasant is to own his own land, and so that he wants to be a capitalist. He does not have a revolutionary aspiration like the workers. And Lenin had called for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and the peasants. That's what Lenin called, his revolutionary movement. We're striving to build a revolutionary government of workers and farmers. Trotsky said, no. We should only have the workers because the peasantry is inherently backward. Trotsky had his theory of permanent revolution that said that the only place that it really matters if you have communism is in the Western countries, because the countries in the back in Asia and the developing world, countries like Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba, are too poor to really have socialism. So they just have to, if you have a revolution there, they just have to seize it and be a temporary holdout. He had this whole theory of permanent revolution, which Lenin rejected. And he was considered an enemy of the Bolsheviks. And he went around agitating for what he called the United States of Europe. He wanted to create the European Union and combine all the European countries into one country. And Lenin said that, no, we don't want that, because that'll strengthen imperialism. To have all the imperialist countries combine their strength into one, we don't want some kind of NATO to be formed. We don't want some kind of European Union to be formed. We want to break apart the imperialist world. We want to fracture the imperialist world so the countries of the developing world can be free. So there was some pretty big disagreements there. So Trotsky wasn't a Bolshevik. Trotsky did not become a Bolshevik until July of 1917. After he came back to Russia from New York City, after he saw that it was very clear that the Bolsheviks were the main revolutionary party, that they were going to win, he applied for membership in the Bolshevik Party, and he was allowed to join the Bolsheviks. That was Trotsky. Trotsky represented the middle-class revolutionary intelligentsia. There was another guy, and this guy represented the working class. And he was from a very, very, very small town called Gori in Georgia. His father was a bootmaker who made boots. And his mother wanted him to become a priest and had raised money like crazy to send him to seminary school. And Stalin, Joseph Zhugashvili Stalin, was from a poor, small village in Georgia. He went to seminary school, and he was a bad kid at seminary school. He was a rebel, and he eventually got kicked out of seminary school. His mom stopped paying his bills, or something happened. He was kicked out of seminary school. And Stalin was a brilliant trade union organizer. And he could read and write, which put him ahead of a lot of people in the country. And he was a very good speaker, and he had an ability to teach people and engage with them about ideas. And Stalin was a guy who spent his life going from region to region, from area to area, organizing strikes, organizing uprisings and protests. He organized a strike of oil workers. He organized a day of action to unify Muslims and Christians in Azerbaijan. He was constantly traveling around organizing people. And Stalin was the editor of the Pravda newspaper at the time that Lenin came back from exile, at the time the Russian Revolution was happening. The editor of the Pravda newspaper was Stalin. And Stalin put out this newspaper called Pravda, which was the agitational newspaper. And Stalin, this guy from Georgia, and I believe he had some kind of deformity, like his foot or his arm or something. He had some deformity, right? And he was just a very good speaker and writer. And he was also a guy, I mean, he robbed banks and he had engaged in fights, and he'd been in and out of prison. And this Stalin was a pretty tough guy, and he was an organizer. And Stalin very much represented the working class wing of the Bolsheviks. He was the guy who held the trade unions together. He was the guy who put out the newspaper that stirred everyone up to confrontation. He was the guy who walked into banks with a gun and robbed bank tellers and robbed people at gunpoint to raise money for the Bolshevik Party. He was the guy who got shit done on the ground, knew how to talk to people, etc. The Russian Revolution happened, and after the death of Lenin, Stalin and Trotsky began to disagree with each other. Trotsky said that the Soviet Union should commit itself to his theory of permanent revolution. He said that the Soviet Union should focus on spreading communism throughout the world and spreading it to the Western world where it matters. And Stalin said, nope, we've got to focus on building socialism in one country. Because the Germans, there's going to probably be a world war when the capitalist economy crashes. We got to be ready. We got to be industrialized and ready to defend ourselves. The Germans will eventually invade us. And we may need to sign some treaties and make some deals with capitalist companies. We need to hire General Electric to come in and help us build power plants. We need to hire the, Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, to come and help us set up our oil industry. And if that means we have to sign some treaties and do that, and that means that we can't be screaming communist revolution, that's necessary because we need to build this place up and raise people's living standards and be ready for the inevitable invasion that will come when the capitalist economy collapses. When there's an economic crisis, they're going to invade us. It's going to lead to a war, and they're going to target us in their war. So Stalin advocated socialism in one country, and Trotsky advocated permanent revolution. And in 1928, Stalin became the new leader of the Soviet Union. Trotsky and his faction were defeated, and another faction led by Bukharin, the Bukharinites, the right opposition, they were also defeated. And Stalin became the new leader, and the Soviet Union launched 5-year plans to start industrializing the country, just as the Western capitalist economies started having the Great Depression. But the Trotskyites, they broke with the Soviet Union. Trotsky went into exile. First he went to Turkey, then he went to France, then he went to Mexico, died in Mexico. And all over the world, but most especially in the Western countries, in France, in Britain, and in the United States, people that were in the communist parties, people who had liked the Soviet Union, who liked Trotsky and did not like Stalin, broke away, and they formed new organizations, new communist parties, new groups that claimed the heritage and the legacy of Marx and Lenin, that denounced Stalin and were loyal to Trotsky. And eventually Trotsky started the Fourth International, which was an international grouping of his followers. They were called the Fourth International. Whereas those who remained loyal to the Soviet Union, remained loyal to Stalin, they led the Communist International, the Comintern, and they formed communist parties around the world that led workers in strikes, eventually mobilized anti-fascist divisions, anti-fascist mobilizations, etc. So this divide between Stalin and Trotsky, it's very interesting to take note of what the divide was about. Because when it really got down to it, a lot of the people who went with Trotsky were like Trotsky. They were middle-class intellectuals. And a lot of the people that went with Stalin were like Stalin. They were organizers, factory workers, etc. And if you look at the Communist Party of the United States, there are some exceptions. There were some factory workers who went with Trotsky, but the bulk of the followers of Trotsky were middle-class intellectuals. And the mass organizers, the people who built the unemployment councils, the people who organized in the labor unions, etc., they tended to be people that went with the Communist Party, with Stalin. It was a divide on class lines. You're on the list. It was a divide along class lines. Trotsky represented the middle class. Stalin represented the working class. And this divide was the very beginning of the synthetic left, and it was the very beginning of neoconservatism. Both neoconservatism and wokeism can trace their origin, can be traced back to this divide. And I believe I have a book here. Do I have it? I have it somewhere. Somewhere I have the book. Oh, goodness. My bookshelf. But anyway, right before Trotsky died, he had a big fight with a bunch of his followers. And what was the fight about? And the fight was about the fact that the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis. In the fall of 1939, the Soviet Union, that had tried to form an alliance with all the Western capitalist countries but had no success, finally, as an act of desperation, signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis. They drew a line down Europe that your army won't go on this side, Hitler, our army won't go on this side, Soviet Union. And that pact, the 1939 non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, changed politics in the Western world very dramatically. Because the communist parties had been making a really big deal about how they were anti-fascist. They'd been the leaders of anti-fascist united fronts and coalitions. They'd been big supporters of Franklin Roosevelt because he was anti-fascist. They had gone into the streets to fight the fascists and Hitler supporters in Britain at the Battle of Cable Street. They fought Oswald Mosley. And that the communist parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union had made a big deal about being anti-fascist. But yet, when none of the Western democratic countries would sign a treaty with them, an alliance with them against the fascists, they then had no choice. The Soviet Union turned around and made a deal with the fascists. And at that point, many people who had been sympathetic and friendly to the communist parties because they were anti-fascist got very angry with the communist parties. Roosevelt was very angry with the Communist Party. He threw Earl Browder in federal prison for a passport violation, sent the Department of Justice after him. The Communist Party, its leaders were being persecuted. And Time magazine started calling the communists the communazis because they had signed a deal with Nazi Germany. And there was all this widespread condemnation. The capitalist press started saying, well, the communists are a bunch of hypocrites and liars. For the last 5-6 years, they've been screaming about anti-fascism, but now they signed a deal with Hitler, so they're a bunch of lying hypocrites. That was what the mainstream media was saying. And the Trotskyists were also affected by this because Trotsky, he was against Stalin and he was against the Soviet leadership, but he maintained that the Soviet Union was still what he called a degenerated workers' state. That even though it had what he called a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy or a parasitical bureaucracy, he argued that the economic foundations of the Soviet Union were still socialist. And that if the Soviet Union were invaded, it was necessary to support the Soviet Union. That was Trotsky's position. But there was a group of people that were the majority of Trotskyists in America. By far, they were a big majority among American Trotskyists, and they were led by these people, the New York intellectuals. And the New York intellectuals, led by Max Shachtman, Martin A. Byrne, and James Burnham. They were the three leaders of the New York intellectuals. They said, no. The fact that the Soviet Union would sign a treaty with the Nazis shows that they are not a socialist country. They are not a workers' state. And some of them said it was state capitalism. And some of them said it was a new system called bureaucratic collectivism. But regardless, They argued that no, the Soviet Union was no good because they would sign that treaty. And they argued that Trotsky maintained some authoritarian Stalinist tendencies, and there wasn't enough freedom of speech inside inside the Trotskyite groups, and they broke with Trotskyism. Shachtman, Aburn, Burnham, they broke with Trotskyism. The New York intellectuals. One of those New York intellectuals was a guy named Irving Kristol. Pull up a picture of Irving Kristol. This guy was one of those New York intellectuals. Let's find a better picture. He's the father of Bill Kristol, the editor of the Weekly Standard. Here, let's put a picture of him up. He'd been a Trotskyite. He'd been a New York intellectual. He'd broken with Trotsky over the question of whether the Soviet Union had any socialist foundations or not. This guy, Irving Kristol. And I'm going to read to you what he wrote. And this is very important. Irving Kristol. I'm going to read you from his obituary in the New York Times. Headline, it's published September 18th, 2009. It's Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism. I'm going to read to you from his obituary. It's one particular passage that is very, very, very telling. Here we go. After marrying, Mr. Kristol followed his wife to Chicago, where she was doing graduate work and where he had what he called his first real experience of America. Drafted into the Army with a number of Midwesterners who were street tough and often anti-Semitic, he found himself shedding his youthful, radical optimism. I can't build socialism with these people, he concluded. They'll probably take it over and make a racket out of it. In his opinion, his fellow GIs were inclined to loot, rape, and murder, and only Army discipline held them in check. It was a perception about human nature that would stay with him for the rest of his life, creating a tension with his alternative view that ordinary people were to be trusted more than intellectuals to do the right thing. That's from his obituary. He'd been this radical communist or whatever, but he actually met the working class. He actually met them, and he didn't like them. He thought they were idiots. He thought they were criminals, street toughs or whatever. He didn't like them. And that is what ultimately got him to stop being a socialist. But what's interesting was Irving Kristol, after World War II, somehow got involved with American intelligence. And after World War II, the CIA tapped him to start something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA operation to funnel money to leftists, people that were critical of capitalism, people that were advocates of socialism, but people who were against the Soviet Union. And Irving Kristol started this program. And Irving Kristol is largely considered to be the godfather of neoconservatism. That's what the headline of his New York Times obituary, I'll drop the link in the chat, his New York Times obituary refers to him as the godfather of neoconservatism. That's what he was called. Irving Kristol, godfather of modern conservatism, dies at 89. You can read in his obit about how much he hated the working class, how much he considered them inferior. All right? It's all in the obituary, everything I just read you. He started running the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program and funneling money to leftist writers. Leftist writers that were against the Soviet Union, that were against actual Marxism, people like Hannah Arendt, people like Susan Sontag, etc. And what we call the synthetic left traces its origins back to that. It was Trotskyites getting paid by the CIA to reinvent what leftist discourse was. During McCarthyism, the U.S. government had tried to crush all socialism, crush all leftism. But now they had a new strategy, which is we're going to find a leftism or a socialism that we can agree with. A leftism or a socialism that will serve our interests and oppose the Soviet Union. And the synthetic left, what we call wokeism, all of that, started with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. However, I'll come back to that later. But first, we're going to talk about where neoconservatism came from. McCarthyism had been a disaster in the United States. A member of the U.S. Senate committed suicide because Joe McCarthy was blackmailing him. There was a member of the U.S. Senate whose son was gay, and Joe McCarthy blackmailed him over it, and he ended up killing himself. All kinds of very prominent people that were not communists, that were part of the American political establishment, got their lives destroyed, got their reputations destroyed. And by about 1954, the American public was tired of McCarthyism. People were tired of the witch hunt. People were tired of being told that they weren't allowed to say what they could believe. McCarthyism was basically cancel culture. People tattled on each other. And if you got caught saying anything that sounded like a communist, everyone denounced you and you got your reputation destroyed. Hollywood writers got dragged before committees and sent to jail. McCarthyism was awful. You know, we have no idea. Our generation has no idea. I remember when I was in high school, I got my hands on some communist newspapers. One of my teachers, had said, he said, my dad was a Teamster, and every year at the Teamster convention he would go to, there'd be communists there. So he actually met some communists, he told me, and they'd be there selling their newspapers and stuff. And I said, oh, well, did you get any of the newspapers? And I remember my teacher looked at me and he said, no, Caleb. No, he didn't buy their newspapers. He said, and then he took the communist newspaper out of my hand. And he said, Caleb, you don't understand. Until about 20, 30 years ago, if I saw this in your hand, I had something on you. And that wasn't even McCarthyism. That wasn't even the 50s. He was just, saying, until about 20, 30 years ago, if you so much as had this in your hand, you were a red. You were in dangerous, dangerous territory. You could lose your job. You could lose your job because somebody saw you with a communist newspaper in your hand. You could have the police come to your house and ask questions because you had a communist newspaper in your hand. That was McCarthyism. McCarthyism was very, very extreme. So as McCarthyism was fading, as McCarthyism was unpopular, Democrats started winning all the elections. Right? Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican, but he got elected largely because he was a Republican who was against McCarthyism. And then after Dwight Eisenhower, you had John F. Kennedy, and he won the elections And during the election, during shortly after he was elected, he actually went to go see a movie that was written by a communist screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo. And John F. Kennedy made a big point of saying he was against McCarthyism. And after that, 1964, you had Lyndon Johnson, who was running for president of the United States, run against Barry Goldwater. And they portrayed Barry Goldwater as a crazy right-wing militaristic McCarthyist. And they did that ad with the daisy and the nuclear bomb going off. And everyone thought that Barry Goldwater was a crazy right-wing McCarthyist. And he lost the election. And Lyndon Johnson was elected president. Republicans were losing because they were associated with McCarthyism. And everyone hated McCarthyism. People were tired of being told to what they could say, what they weren't allowed to say. People were tired of people, in the government constantly accusing everything of being communist and telling them that they needed to get ready for war and militarism. McCarthyism was unpopular. And so Democrats were winning. But the Democrats still escalated the Vietnam War. And even though they passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the black community was still unhappy. And by 1968, you had a massive political crisis in the United States. You had college kids burning their draft cards, refusing to fight in Vietnam, running through the streets of major cities, waving the Vietnamese flag, chanting, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win." You had thousands of Americans that went to Canada because they didn't want to fight in Vietnam. There was a whole network set up to actually help American GIs flee to Canada so they could not have to serve in Vietnam. And that there was this whole network to smuggle American GIs into Vietnam to help them not fight in the war. There were divisions of the U.S. Army, like the American Servicemen's Union and the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, that were not refusing to fight. And there was a whole uprising. And April 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, and every major city in the United States went up in flames. The black community was furious that even though Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been a pacifist and advocated nonviolence, he was still murdered. And the Black Panthers were rising. And there was a political crisis in the United States. And amid that political crisis, many in the ruling class said, okay, this Cold War liberalism stuff, not going to work anymore. We need to bring the hammer down. We need to arrest and crush the Black Panther Party. We need to break apart these anti-war protesters and these anti-war hippies. And in that moment, the Republican Party realized that if we're going to win, we can't be the party of Barry Goldwater any longer. We can't be a party of nut jobs. The John Birch Society was this far right-wing group that said that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist, that said that communists had poured mind control into the drinking water and were brainwashing people with the drinking water. And the Republicans said, we can be the party that'll win on a platform of crushing the radicals. And who did the Republican Party hire as their strategist? Who became one of the strategists to develop the methods for the Republican Party rebounding to crush the left? Irving Kristol. And starting in the 1968 presidential election, the Republican Party changed its messaging and started presenting itself very differently. And I am actually going to play for you a hit song that came out in 1968, the year of the presidential election, right? The year that Richard Nixon was elected president of the United States, right? You got this song that was a hit. I'm going to put it on. I'm going to put this song on for you. Let me just download it here for you. This was a hit song, and the Republican Party started reinventing its messaging. And this is the beginning of what you can call neoconservatism. The Republican Party realized it couldn't be the party of the John Birch Society anymore. It couldn't be the party of Barry Goldwater. I mean, it was at that point, it was more or less the party of what we would now consider to be like Alex Jones, right? It was a party that thought there was a conspiracy by globalists, that had global communists that have infiltrated the government. You know, it was the Republican Party was sounding Alex Jonesy, and they couldn't win elections anymore. However, there was a very big threat to the system. There were a lot of black people that were rising up and revolting under the leadership of the Black Panthers. There were a lot of college students and young people who were refusing to fight in Vietnam and didn't support U.S. imperialism around the world and were becoming sympathetic to communism. And the Cold War liberalism that had started out as an effort to control McCarthyism, so to make U.S. imperialism function more effectively, had given birth to a genuine political crisis. So amid that political crisis, the Republican Party, under the leadership of Irving Kristol, former Trotskyist, reinvented itself. It reinvented itself in order to win, in order to be the party that would represent the American establishment, crushing the black radicals and crushing the anti-war movement, that would restore support for the military, etc. And they did it in a very, very, very interesting way. I'm going to put the song on for you because it will surprise you, right? And this is important history. You got to know this, right? You got to know this. All right? This is someone recording their own version of a hit song from 1968.
There was a guy at the bar that said he wanted to hear a lot of Merle Haggard. Oh, there he is. There's another Merle Haggard song for you, brother. We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. We don't take our trips on LSD. We don't burn our draft cards down on Main Street. We like living right and being free. We don't make a party out of loving. We like holding hands and pitching moon. We don't let our hair grow long and shaggy like the hippies out in San Francisco do. And I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, a place where even squares can have a ball. We still wave old glory down at the courthouse. White lightning still the biggest thrill of all. Leather boots are still in style for manly footwear. Beads and Roman sandals won't be seen. And football's still the roughest thing on campus. And the kids here still respect the college dean. And I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, a place where even squares can have a ball. We still wave old glory down at the courthouse. And white lightning still the biggest thrill of all. In Muskogee, Oklahoma, USA.
And that song, even though someone's pointing out that Merle Haggard, the folk singer, kind of meant it to be ironic, regardless, that song was all about how middle America, average, hardworking Americans, didn't want any of those protesters, didn't want any of that hippie stuff. They didn't like those radicals who were complaining. And Richard Nixon came to office talking about a silent majority. A silent majority that didn't want anything to do with the black radicals and the black protests, didn't want anything to do with protesting the Vietnam War. And conservatism was reinvented. Instead of being this radical anti-communist fanaticism movement, conservatism became this populism, this pseudo-populism. It was for the average Joe who's never read Marx, and he's never read Lenin and all of that, but he just likes his country, and he doesn't appreciate all these people that are always running it down, and he wants people to work hard and not get money on welfare, and it was a new kind of reinvention of conservative messaging, where conservatives were no longer like radical anti-communists. Instead, they were just people who were stood up for good old-fashioned American values. And that was neoconservatism. And Richard Nixon kind of started it. But Richard Nixon, you'll notice, was quite left-wing in terms of his economic policies. He created the Office of Workplace Health and Safety, right? He created the EPA. He advocated a guaranteed minimum income. Like, Richard Nixon was actually pretty far to the left of modern conservatives. But it was just the beginning. It was the messaging style. It was the messaging style that was the beginning of what you can call neoconservatism. And then, under Richard Nixon, and this is very interesting to me, Richard Nixon's good friend, and I'll put a picture of him on here as well. Richard Nixon had a very, very good friend, his spiritual advisor, who was anti-Semitic and didn't like Jews, and who was a big supporter of the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon's spiritual advisor, Richard Nixon's buddy, was this guy. And there's tapes of Richard Nixon and him having conversations about why they didn't like Jewish people, and why they thought liberal media was out to get them. And this guy, the Reverend Billy Graham, he was Richard Nixon's spiritual advisor, Reverend Billy Graham. And Reverend Billy Graham, because he was the president of the United States spiritual advisor, who frequently met with Richard Nixon and gave him advice, he started having broadcasts on television. Billy Graham had been around since the 1950s. He had been the leader of, a widespread, Christian revivalism in the 1950s. He was just this Southern pastor from North Carolina. And Richard Nixon really liked him. Richard Nixon was a Quaker by faith. That was his faith of origin. But Billy Graham and Richard Nixon, they just got along very, very well. And Billy Graham had these TV broadcasts he would do where he would preach sermons. And Billy Graham was a Republican, conservative, was a supporter of the Vietnam War, had not exactly been a supporter of civil rights. I believe early on he'd said things like black people and white people shouldn't be allowed to get married to each other and stuff like that. He changed his view on that pretty quick, but he was a conservative. And Billy Graham realized that young Americans were not going to church, and young Americans were not Christians and were not conservative. They were into rock and roll music. They were using drugs. But there was a weird variation, and this is where it gets interesting. There was a weird variation of the hippie movement called the Jesus Freaks. And it was one weird spin-off. There were many, the youth counterculture. There were hippies that were vegetarians. There were hippies that were into communist radical activism. There were hippies that were like feminists, women's rights hippies. There were hippies that were, going and setting up communes in the woods. And there were hippieism, counterculture was so widespread, and it was being promoted by all the mainstream media, all the major TV networks, all the movies that came out. Hippieism was just very widespread. One variation of hippieism was called Jesus Freaks. And they were hippies who their hippieism was expressed in the form of Christianity. And many of them were Roman Catholic. Many of them adhered to the idea that you needed only one church. And so you should join the Catholic Church in the hope that the Christians of the world can unite into one. But it was just, and in San Francisco and in Los Angeles and in New York City a little bit, There was one weird variant of hippies, of people with long hair who used drugs and engaged in sexual promiscuity, but would get on the subways and in a drugged outfit shout, "Jesus loves you, man." And, they were usually against the Vietnam War. They were usually sympathetic to the civil rights movement, but they were long-haired hippies, and somehow their hippieism fit in with Christianity for whatever reason, right? A lot of them had used LSD, the drug, and while they were on the drug, they had felt they had talked with Jesus, or they talked with God while they were on LSD, and so that had caused them to become super religious after using drugs. There was a lot of different, it was a weird thing, but among the hippies, there was one particular variation of hippie called a Jesus freak. And there were a number of them. And there were a number of little groupings around the country of hippies who were religious. Well, Billy Graham got the idea that those people could become Republicans. This is very interesting. He realized that one of the main reasons that people are conservative is because they're Republicans, or is because they're Christian. Religion is one of the main conservatizing factors, right? What makes people more conservative. And so Billy Graham started featuring Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. Right? And this was a weird moment because these Jesus freaks, they were hippies. These Jesus freaks played rock and roll music. But Billy Graham got the idea that in order to get young people to watch his broadcasts, he would start having Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. And so he started bringing young Jesus freaks on before he would give one of his sermons. They would come out and they would play a rock and roll Christian song. And we don't know why, but the media, mainstream media, took a very particular interest in Jesus freaks. There were documentaries made about them. They started featuring them in movies. Movies would talk about them. And one thing led to another. And the Jesus freak wing of the hippie movement started to expand. And suddenly, this kind of weird Christianity, it was Christianity, but it had counterculture aesthetics. Long hair, rock and roll music, guitars. Suddenly, that started catching on. And in California in particular, where there were a lot of hippies, there were 2 Broadway musicals that promoted this stuff, Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell. And suddenly there was kind of a reinvention of Christianity for a new generation. And suddenly there were a new layer of young people who would attend churches again. And there was a new kind of church that would appeal to people who'd grown up watching television. Right? Really what it got down to was boomers. They'd grown up watching TV. They'd grown up listening to Elvis Presley and the Beatles and rock music. So church was a big nap for them. It was really, really boring. It was really boring. Well, somebody invented a new form of Christianity with rock and roll music, with bright lights, with very exciting sermons, and that would appeal to boomers. And so as the 1970s went on, what we can now call the religious right, right? I mean, and now, it really started gradually piecing itself together. You had a number of religious sects that recruited among the hippies. And that was a really common thing. There was, I'm trying to remember, there's many different names. Well, there was a guy named Tony Alamo, who had been a Beatles marketer, and he started his own religious group. And in Southern California and in many parts of the country, you had a number of religious sects that recruited hippies to be Christian conservatives. And people wouldn't even know that they were hippies. People wouldn't even know that they were Christians, right? They would just recruit hippies, and there were a number of these like religious sects that were recruiting people. And by the late 1970s, you had Jerry Falwell, and Jerry Falwell came out, and he announced the formation of something called the Moral Majority, which was kind of like Nixon. It was this populist thing, but it was a very dumbed down, watered down Christianity that supported conservatism, that thought Jimmy Carter was a radical leftist, etc. And there was an anti-abortion film that was made that was specifically designed to appeal to hippies. It's called The Silent Scream. It was an anti-abortion film, that was made by Jesus freaks that they showed everywhere. It was this very, very strange movie. I'm trying to see if I can find it online. But it was this anti-abortion film that they made that was very much a hippie anti-abortion film. And one thing led to another. And you had this widespread religious movement. And what I think is interesting, right, is that I've been telling you all about Irving Kristol. Right, and that neoconservative politics, the reinvention of conservatism to be this kind of populism, that's the essence of neoconservatism. But you cannot forget about the role of another person. This guy, who was also a very important political strategist, who was also a mentor to the people that we now call the synthetic left as well. And this guy was a philosophy professor. He'd started out he'd fled Nazi Germany. He was Jewish. He'd lived in Nazi Germany, and he'd fled Nazi Germany. And he'd moved, first he taught at the New School, and then he was at the University of Chicago. And this guy was also considered to be one of the fathers of neoconservatism as well. This guy. And this guy's name is Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss. He's a philosophy professor. And Leo Strauss, his big book that he published is called Persecution and the Art of Writing. And Leo Strauss taught that all the great philosophers of history, Kant, Plato, Descartes, all of them had to write in code because they were afraid of persecution by the ignorant rabble, by the masses. And that the ignorant rabble get together and suppress the great intellectuals. And so the job of intellectuals is to protect freedom. And the greatest threat to freedom is the ignorant rabble. The ignorant rabble. The average people are a threat to freedom. And his favorite television show was Gunsmoke. And I'll actually pull up. We ought to, Gunsmoke theme. Is there like an opening for Gunsmoke? We can put that on, right? Yeah. Gunsmoke. His favorite TV show was this one. Well, it's called Gunsmoke. Gunsmoke was a 1950s Western. He used to show Gunsmoke to his students, the students that he taught, many of whom became figures in the Ronald Reagan administration, people that were very prominent. But among them were also many of the people that make up the synthetic left, like Susan Sontag, right? But the show was called Gunsmoke. The show was called Gunsmoke. And here, I'll put it on. I'll put on Gunsmoke. It was a popular Western television program, and he used to watch it with his students. Gunsmoke. And in Gunsmoke, the good guy wears a white hat. He's all good. The bad guy wears a black hat. He's all bad. There's no ambiguity. The good guy is all good. The bad guy is all bad. And Leo Strauss said that's the way the average people need to understand politics. We, the intellectuals, we're smart enough. We can understand the complexities. But for average people, we need them to understand politics like Gunsmoke. We need them to think America is all good and that communism is all bad. No ambiguity, no questions about it, because the average people are too stupid to understand it, and we need to keep them under control. And essentially, Leo Strauss's writing focused on the noble lie, the idea that you need to lie, that some people, the bulk of the masses of people, are not smart enough to run the government, are not smart enough to have a say, and when they get together, they take away the freedom of the great intellectuals. And so it is necessary for the intellectuals to lie. It is necessary for the intellectuals to manipulate. It's necessary for the intellectuals to do that. It's very similar to what Irving Kristol said about his experience in the army and how he stopped being a communist because he hated the working class, right? It's the same mindset. It's an anti-totalitarianism that doesn't see totalitarianism as these powerful leaders that violate people's freedom. It sees totalitarianism as the oppression of the majority against the educated ones. It's kind of a weird flip. When you think of totalitarianism, you think of some all-powerful state or dictatorship that's controlling the people. Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss, they flip it. And they think of totalitarianism as ignorant, stupid, inferior rabble controlling the smart people, the superior ones. It's a lot like Ayn Rand, right? The great intellectuals, the great men, the motor of the world are being persecuted by the mob. That's how they see it, right? That individuals, these individual intellectuals are superior, and if the rabble get together, they will not be able to rule over people the way they would like to. That's the idea. It's anti-populism. And that in order to control people, you need mass media and you need propaganda to control them. And Leo Strauss, you can be absolutely sure Leo Strauss has had a big impact on American politics because we had two neoconservative presidents who specifically went out of their way to cultivate a cowboy image. Ronald Reagan had played a cowboy in many, many movies, and George W. Bush, even though he was from Connecticut, he adopted a Texas accent, and he wore a cowboy hat, and he made a big point of being on his ranch, and both of them, Bush and Reagan both worked really, really hard to sound like cowboys, to sound like the good guy on Gunsmoke. And you'll remember when George W. Bush was president, when he was invading Afghanistan, he said, we're going to smoke them out, smoke them out. That's a cowboy movie term, smoke them out, right? That's in cowboy movies. We're going to smoke them out, right? Ronald Reagan, his Secret Service nickname was Rawhide because he was a cowboy actor. He called himself, they said Rawhide. Rawhide was his Secret Service nickname, right? And that's neoconservatism and evangelical Christianity, what we now call evangelical Christianity, which is mega churches, which is loud Christian music, which is very watered down. I just believe the Bible, man. God will help you figure it out, man. I can't explain it. All of that is that's the neoconservative package. Okay. When we're talking about neoconservatism, we're not talking about a set of principles. We're talking about an orientation, right? There was a book published by one of these neoconservatives. It's called David Horowitz, The Art of Political War. When we talk about, Leo Strauss and his elitist mindset, when we talk about Irving Kristol and neoconservatism, what we're really talking about, what we're describing, is an orientation of conservatives to be believers in the establishment in a kind of vaguely populist way, and to promote a very watered down, simplistic understanding of the world in order to control the masses, in order to support military interventions around the world, in order to advance U.S. interests. It's okay to lie to people. It's okay to manipulate the broad masses of people and not tell them the truth. It's okay. You need to whip up the population into the belief that that America is all right and the opponents of America are all bad. You need to dumb things down, and you need to kind of manipulate the masses with this vague pseudo-populism and make sure they're not thinking too much in order to protect freedom. And that's a big part of neoconservatism also, is they oppose communism, they oppose any Marxist or socialist state because they see it as the rabble taking over, and they equate communism and fascism as the rabble taking over. Right? That is neoconservatism. And Brzezinski was not one of these people. Right? RFK said Brzezinski was a neoconservative. No, he wasn't. Brzezinski was a Carter guy. He was a liberal. Brzezinski's whole thing was recruiting communists and playing different communists against each other. Brzezinski's whole thing was working with Muslims and using them against the Soviet Union, etc. Brzezinski was not a neoconservative. Neoconservatism was Irving Kristol. Neoconservatism was Leo Strauss. Neoconservatism is John Bolton. And starting in the 1980s, you had a whole wing of the American state, of the American State Department, the American Diplomatic Corps, the American Strategic Institutes, the American Enterprise Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations. You had a layer of people who called themselves Sovietologists. You can look this up. Or sometimes they called themselves Kremlinologists. And what they did was they obsessively studied communism with the understanding that they aimed to completely destroy it. Kremlinologists, Sovietologists. All right, that's Victoria Nuland. All right, that's Robert Ford. Right, a lot of the names that are now associated with the anti-Russia hysteria, the anti-Putin hysteria, the people that pushed for the U.S. invasion of Iraq, these are people that were from this crowd of people. They were being trained by Irving Kristol. They were being trained by Leo Strauss. They were in the Reagan administration. They were in the first Bush administration and the second Bush administration. And they want war to overthrow the communists. They have no desire to recruit Europe to be on the side of the United States. If Europe doesn't go along with what the USA wants, who cares, right? They're excited about wars to spread freedom and defeat communism, which is the ultimate threat to the superior intellectuals, right? That's the way they think. And they tend to be big supporters of Israel because they see Israel as standing up against the Arab barbarians, the inferior Arab barbarians. They tend to be, big advocates of U.S. military interventions. That's neoconservatism. So if anyone asks you what neoconservatism is, this is what they're talking about. So that's number one. Now back to the synthetic left. So Irving Kristol, as I told you, he was part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this was a CIA program to funnel money to leftists and socialists who were against the Soviet Union. It was Trotskyites and others, Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag, Irving Howe. They were all getting paid lots of money, subsidized and made famous to be famous socialists, famous leftists, famous intellectuals who were against the Soviet Union, against China, against communism. But they were leftists. They were against McCarthyism. They were against, they didn't like American culture. All right. Susan Sontag has an essay, Notes on Camp, all about how she doesn't like cowboy movies and she doesn't like kitsch kitsch tchotchkes and house decorations, and she doesn't like consumerism and mass marketing. And you have Theodor Adorno and the Frankfurt School, and you have you have Herbert Marcuse, who was like a literal like State Department CIA guy right during World War II, and they made him the top Marxist thinker in Germany. You had a whole layer of these intellectuals who were being promoted, and they're supposed to be Marxists, and they quote Marx in their work. But unlike Marxists, they're not talking about the working class rising up against the capitalist class. Instead, they're talking about how mass marketing and consumerism is kind of like brainwashing and you lose your freedom. They're talking about how American culture is really crass and stupid, and Americans aren't smart because the movies are so stupid. They're talking about how Theodor Adorno, his very famous study. I think I've got it somewhere over here. Here. His very famous study was the authoritarian personality. The authoritarian personality. And he goes through Europe and interviews former Nazis and the idea that fascism isn't rooted in the breakdown of capitalism. Fascism isn't rooted in capitalism and decay or whatever. No, fascism is rooted in there's a certain type of person that wants to go fight for a cause. There's a certain type of person who believes that right and wrong exist. There's a certain type of person that has moral principles that they believe in. There's a certain type of person who believes in God. There's a certain type of person who wants to go out and fight, who respects strong leaders, and that is a dangerous thing. It's called the authoritarian personality, and that's what you got to fight against, right? That we need to teach people that there is no real truth in the world. We need to teach people to see things in shades of gray, because the authoritarian personality is what gave birth to Nazism. And this is huge in academia, right? It's huge. It's this idea that fascism is everyday people. Fascism is ordinary people who just aren't smart enough to be sophisticated liberals. And communism is just another kind of fascism. When people get together and start demanding their rights and wanting a government of action, that's the authoritarian personality. And we got to set up special protections to protect the intellectuals from fascism or communism or any kind of mass movement, because it's the same thing that Leo Strauss was talking about. It's the exact same stuff. And it's the same thing Irvin Kristol is talking about, except it's aimed at leftists and socialists rather than at conservatives. But it's the same message. The people are the enemy. Right and wrong are ambiguous. Average people need to be controlled in order to prevent them from getting together and taking away the freedom of the great superior intellectuals. It's the same mindset. It's Nietzscheism. It's the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. It's what they call philosophical irrationalism. It's the same teaching. The synthetic left and the neocons have the same overall worldview. They hate people. They think people are the problem. They think the problem is not capitalism. The problem is not the irrationality of our capitalist system. The problem is people. People are just bad deep down, and some of us are smart enough to be nice, but the bulk of human beings are just bad, and so we got to control them, and we got to restrain them, because if they get together, they'll take away our freedom, and the smart people need to find ways to control and manipulate the rest of humanity, because the rest of humanity are just bad. That's what they believe. That's their belief. Well, the synthetic left in the United States gave birth to the counterculture, right? Right? People think that the hippies were communists. They were not. They didn't like the Beatles in the Soviet Union. They did not like drugs in the Soviet Union. They didn't like this stuff. They didn't like blue jeans in the Soviet Union. Right? And the hippie counterculture thing was very, very opposed to what the socialist countries were doing. It was very, very opposed to what they were doing. And then Susan Sontag, who's one of the big synthetic left intellectuals, she actually came out and said it in the 80s. She was at a rally supporting the striking dock workers, the Solidarność dock workers of Poland against the communist government. And she said, communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. And the counterculture, the hippie stuff that was promoted in the mass media, while it was critical of American society, it was not communist. Right? There's a passage, if you go and read Daily Life in Revolutionary China by Maria Masayoshi, a communist Italian member of parliament who went to China during the Cultural Revolution. The Red Guards went to her and they said, is it true that in America the boys grow their hair long like girls and they voluntarily use narcotics? And she said, yes. And she said, don't they realize they're being tools of the bourgeoisie? They didn't like counterculture hippie stuff in East Germany. They didn't like counterculture hippie stuff in Cuba, right? The synthetic left, the counterculture, the hippie thing, that was very much made in order to counter communism among Western intellectuals. But it started serving another purpose. This gets very interesting. It started serving another purpose because in the 1960s, you had a new generation of people in the Soviet Union, just like we had people coming up in the United States who've been born after World War II. There were many people in the Eastern Bloc and former Soviet Union that had been born after World War II as well. And people who grew up in the Soviet Union were not going to listen to right-wing Americans. They weren't going to listen to Americans who said, your system is evil, your people are evil, communism is evil, embrace America, embrace Jesus, embrace capitalism. They weren't going to listen to them. But they would listen to the synthetic left. And starting in the early 1960s, even back into the 50s, there started to be magazines and publications in the Soviet Union and in East Germany and elsewhere that were from reform communists. And they would talk about the generation gap, right? This is a big thing. You listen to the 60s. It's the generation gap, man. You know, our parents, they're the old way, you know, 1968 is not 1948, man, right? Well, they talk the same way in the Soviet Union. They say, well, it's not capitalism versus communism. It's the generation gap, right? And young people, they just want to do their own thing, brother. They just want to do their own thing, right? That was the rhetoric. So it wasn't anti-communist. It was arguing that the Soviet Union and their leaders were authoritarian, just like the American military and their leaders, and that young people just want to hang loose. Right? And this started to be the opening. And there were Trotskyites, American Trotskyite college professors who were going over to the Soviet Union. And there were American artists and filmmakers who were going over to the Soviet Union. And they would go over there and they wouldn't say they were against communism. And they wouldn't say that they were against the Soviet government. They would say, no, we're for freedom. And it got to the point, Timothy Leary, the big drug guru, you listen to anything he says after he came back to the United States. He's like, man, we're not pro-communist. We're not anti-communist. We're just for freedom, man. And you had, Marilyn Ferguson and the Aquarian Conspiracy, right? Which was this whole book about a global awakening movement that they're creating. And that this whole hippie thing was created because there were a lot of younger people, the younger generation of Soviet and leftist and Soviet and Eastern Bloc leaders were coming in. And it was a way of kind of seducing them, of introducing American consumerism, American culture, American media. It was a way of introducing that to them without doing it in a way that would be directly confrontational. It wouldn't seem like a blatant attack on communism. It wouldn't seem like a blatant pro-American statement. And then you saw the Prague Spring, 1968. American intelligence recruited a lot of these young Czech communists to follow a guy named Dubček. And Dubček said he was a communist, but he was for socialism with a human face. He was a democratic socialist, right? And he took over the government in Czechoslovakia, and he cut off support to the Vietnamese, and he was trying to align Czechoslovakia with the United States and set up an anti-Soviet government right in the middle of the Eastern Bloc. Well, the bulk of the population of Czechoslovakia did not want that. But a lot of the young college kids and all of them did. And so the Soviet Union sent its military into Czechoslovakia in 1968. And of course, on American TV, how did they portray it? These young, freedom-loving hippies, they're just out there wanting peace and freedom, and the evil tanks are rolling in to crush them. That's the way they portrayed it. Of course, they didn't show the farmers in Czechoslovakia who were happy that the communist government had enabled them to have their own land and et cetera. They didn't show the workers in the factories whose living standard had gone up and had gotten, healthcare and education and seen their living standards go up because of the communist government. No. They just showed these cold mechanical tanks, these cold mechanical pieces of machinery. And they also just showed the young people who were protesting as just young, idealistic people who wanted freedom, and they were just these romantic people. And the Prague Spring, that was the first. It was like a new formula for the color revolution. And so the next stage, after they did the Congress for Cultural Freedom thing, after they recruited the Trotskyites that broke with Trotsky to become the manipulators of leftist thought in the West, after that, the next stage was sending this, whatever you want to call it, counterculture, this new brand of leftist thought, sending that to the communist world and infiltrating that into the communist world and using it to push American culture, American consumerism, and subtle anti-communism to stir up color revolutions. And the way color revolutions are carried out, we know, is that they're carried out by, is that they get all these young people out there to protest for something. They don't know what they're protesting for. Freedom, freedom. They're against corruption. They're for democracy. Just it's a vague thing. And they are out there and they occupy the square and they're just singing songs of freedom. And CNN and all the media shows them. And then a faction in the government that's aligned with the United States uses the opportunity to carry out a coup. And in 1989, that's what they did in country after country after country. As the young people that loved American rock music and all of that, and wouldn't say they were against communism and wouldn't say they were for capitalism. They just wanted more freedom and they just wanted, American consumer goods, or they were just mad about whatever, would go out and occupy the square and wave their hands and all of that. And then a faction within the government that had been bribed by the Americans and was used by the Americans would seize control of the government and then dismantle communism and dismantle the Marxist-Leninist state. The second stage of the synthetic left was sending it around the world and using it. And as the synthetic left kind of fell out of fashion, right? So back to, after 1968, there had been so much of a confusion in the United States. The neocons came in to kind of clean up the pieces. The synthetic left had gotten a little bit out of hand, right? Even though the synthetic left was anti-communist and all of that, the Black Panthers, they were not synthetic left and they'd emerged from it. There were a lot of communist factions in the 1970s, the new communist movement, and that they didn't have control of the United States. So as the synthetic left got cranked down in the West, right, they kind of put them in their place. They had a war on drugs. They got to exist as the fringe. They were on the college campuses, and there was New York City, Greenwich Village. There was Berkeley or whatever. But the synthetic left was kind of pushed back, and neoconservatism reigned in the United States in the 80s. As that was going on, these people got sent abroad. And this was actually the policy when I was young. Like, I mean, and I'm not that old, right? I'm only 35. But I remember when I was a student, when I was a high school student, my parents wanted to send me someplace, during the summer. They sent me to a peace studies program at a university. And I went to this peace studies program, and it was like a 2-week course. I got college credit for it. And it was all about color revolutions. And it was all about how militarism is authoritarian and non-conforming and people's freedom is crushed. We watched Full Metal Jacket, the first half of Full Metal Jacket, the boot camp part. We read, writings of nonconformists, and it was all about how militarism is brutal and masculine. And, that's all true, right? Militarism is brutal and masculine and all of that. And about how it doesn't work. The real way to bring down dictators, we were taught in this class. I'm just a high school kid. I'm sitting here. I don't know half of what I don't know. I don't know 90% of what I know now. And I'm just sitting there. Even then, I knew something was off about this. But I'm sitting there in the peace studies program, and they're telling us that, that war is rooted in male aggression, and war is rooted in bullying and all kinds of stuff. And it doesn't work. And the way to bring down dictators, we're taught, is like Otpor in Serbia. And we watched a whole movie about Otpor and how this anarchist freedom movement had been started in Yugoslavia that had brought down Milosevic. And I look back at this peace studies course I took, in high school, and it's paid for. The people that fund it are the very foundations that are now all over the world, raging color revolutions. It's George Soros, right? And that the left, it's weird. It's like the American government said, all right, we're always going to have people that disagree. We're going to have people that don't support our wars. We're going to have people that question things. So what we'll do is we'll recruit them into the George Soros apparatus, and we'll send them to Venezuela, and we'll send them to Iran, and we'll send them to Syria. We'll send them to Russia. We'll send them to China to stir up problems. That's basically what existed. Right. And I was a high school kid. I took this 2-week course, and I was interested in communism. I wasn't interested in this, but I sat through this 2-week peace studies course, and I now realize what I was sitting through was basically recruitment for American intelligence. Now, obviously, it was not directly that, but it was recruitment for the NGO, the Ford Foundation, the Color Revolution apparatus. Right. And that was kind of how the United States was after the crisis of the 1960s. Right. We're always going to have dissidents, right? We're always going to have weirdos who just can't support the military, who just can't support us attacking countries, who can't believe our anti-communist lies. So what we'll do is we'll give them jobs in the NGO apparatus, and we'll use them to stir up trouble in other countries. And that was the second stage of the synthetic left, was the color revolution apparatus. They took the 1960s counterculture revolution and they exported it. They sent it around the world to stir up color revolutions. That's two. That's the second stage of the synthetic left. But now, that brings me to where we are now. Back to neoconservatism. George W. Bush was a neoconservative. He was a neocon. He invaded Iraq. And as a result of George W. Bush's presidency, all kinds of things went wrong. Right? George Bush was a neocon. 9/11 happened. After 9/11, they overthrew the Iraqi government. They put crazy sanctions on Iran. They instituted the Patriot Act. The neocon evangelical churches were pushing this anti-Muslim hysteria and getting people to support Israel, and it screwed up a lot of things for American imperialism. First, it drove the oil prices up. The oil prices shot through the roof during the Bush presidency, the highest oil prices in history. An oil-producing country, Iraq, had been blown to bits. Another oil-producing country, Iran, was having sanctions imposed on it. And the oil prices shot through the roof. And this government in Venezuela that was run by a Marxist, Hugo Chavez, suddenly had a huge amount of money. Venezuela started using their oil money to spread socialist politics all across South and Central America. Pretty soon the Sandinistas were back in power in Nicaragua. Pretty soon in Bolivia, there was a Marxist government, Evo Morales. And with that oil money, Marxism and socialism and anti-imperialist politics was spreading all over South America. And in Russia, Putin used the oil money to rebuild Russia's economy. Russia had been a disaster in the 1990s, but Putin came in and he restructured Russia's economy to be centered around state-controlled oil and gas. And it just so happened that at the time he was doing that, Bush invaded Iraq and the oil prices shot through the roof and the natural gas prices shot through the roof. And as a result, Russia was able to very quickly reindustrialize and raise its living standard. Right? And Putin brought Russia back to the industrial level that it was at the time the Soviet Union fell. And that was because Bush had invaded Iraq and shot the oil prices up. What else happened? Iran, right? Iran. Not everyone in Iran agrees about everything. There's the reformist movement that is more sympathetic to the West and the United States. There's the hardliners that are more anti-imperialist and more anti-capitalist. Well, Iran hated Iraq because Iraq had invaded them and killed a lot of their people, etc. But then Bush called Iran the axis of evil, and Bush put sanctions on Iran and was attacking Iran. But Iran is a major oil-producing country, so the oil prices went up, and Iran got way more money. And the people in Iran who benefit from the state revenue, which is where the oil money comes from, the oil in Iran is government-controlled, are the hardliners. It's the Revolutionary Guards. It's the government apparatus. So the people in Iran that are the most anti-imperialist and the most revolutionary and the most anti-capitalist, Ahmadinejad, people like that, they were the main beneficiaries. So Iran was suddenly pushing a much more revolutionary anti-imperialist line. Iran was drifting to be close to Venezuela, close to Cuba, close to Nicaragua. Russia was once again moving, in an independent direction and had rebooted its economy. South America, you had Bolivarianism rising. And then, you'll remember, Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006 and got its ass kicked by Hezbollah. Hezbollah, the Shia militia in Lebanon that's aligned with Iran, that's from the Islamic revolutionary current, of Iran. They take inspiration from the Islamic Revolution of Iran. Israel invaded Lebanon, and Hezbollah kicked their ass. And the whole Muslim world, the United States, George W. Bush had offended the Muslims of the world. He was aligned with these pastors that were saying Islam was an evil religion, that all Muslims were barbarians, etc. And at the same time, he'd called the fight against terrorism a crusade, not good words to use in the Middle East. And so the Muslim world was mad at the United States. Israel invaded Lebanon, and Hezbollah defeated a crushing defeat to Israel. And that is why suddenly the mainstream media turned against George W. Bush. Around 2006, 2007, George W. Bush was no longer liked in American media. No more. Because he had lost control of the world. He may have invaded Iraq. He may have passed all kinds of repressive legislation. Europe wasn't getting along with the United States. The oil prices had enabled a resurgence of anti-imperialism among oil-producing states. The Islamic world were all cheering for Hezbollah, which was aligned with Iran, and that the global anti-imperialist camp was advancing. And what George W. Bush and the neocons had done failed. I mean, they were successful in destroying Iraq. They were successful in rolling back civil liberties. They were successful in driving up the oil prices. They were successful in creating Guantanamo Bay and torturing people. But in terms of securing U.S. domination over the planet, they were failing. Russia was back. Iran was surging forward. Latin America was fighting for freedom. Things were shifting. And so you'll notice that at the end of George W. Bush's second term, the color revolution apparatus came home. And that's step 3 of the synthetic left. Barack Hussein Obama became the candidate of the Democrats. And Barack Obama's entire career was working with the synthetic left, was working with the color revolution apparatus. He'd been the organizer of Acorn. He had gone around the world. He had a Muslim middle name. And that Barack Obama was very much part of the color revolution synthetic left apparatus. He'd been a community organizer in Chicago whose job it was to go around and kind of keep track of black radicals and black leaders in Chicago. You know, he had, if you look at his childhood, his mother, Ann Dunham, was very clearly engaging in intelligence research for the Ford Foundation. And then after that, Obama's first job was with something called the International Business Corporation. It goes around the world doing workshops about the greatness of capitalism. It's clearly some kind of American soft power propaganda project. And Barack Obama represented the synthetic left coming home. And that's what wokeism is. Wokeism is the third stage of the synthetic left. First, they used the synthetic left to try and control dissident circles in America. Then they sent the synthetic left to the anti-imperialist countries to stir up color revolutions. And now, as we're facing a crisis in the United States, living standards are going down, people are angry, and the neocons are not capable of running the government. Now the synthetic left is back. It's back here. The woke armies, all of that, that is the synthetic left. That is the intelligence apparatus. That is the richest of the rich, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefellers, trying to take control of America amid the crisis. And this is all very, very complicated, but this is me trying to explain to you. So when you talk about neoconservatism, we're talking about the reinvention of conservative politics over the course of the Cold War. When we talk about the synthetic left, we're talking about a three-stage process that has led to the foot soldiers of the Biden administration right now. But the important thing to remember is they have the same origin, Trotskyism. Both neoconservatism and the synthetic left are both rooted in Trotskyism. They both hate the masses of people, just like Trotsky hated the Russian peasantry. And on top of that, to top it all off, they both have an elitist worldview. They view the masses of people as inherently dangerous. They're both rooted in philosophical irrationalism. They are two sides of the same coin. They are anti-human. And that is what I want you to understand. The synthetic left and the neocons have the same root, the same cause. They are created to control you. They are created to protect the rich from you. Both of them exist to cultivate smart people to think you are their enemy, and it is their job to lie to you, to manipulate you, to deceive you, and to make sure you have no power in order to protect their supposed greatness and freedom. And that is what I want you to understand tonight. Long, complicated history I just gave you, but you want to understand wokeism, you want to understand the neocons. They're two sides of the same coin, and they have the same origin in Trotskyism. And what they are both afraid of is Stalin, Hugo Chavez, Putin, Xi, Daniel Ortega, Robert Mugabe. That is what they are afraid of. They are afraid of a mass movement that empowers the people to rise up and take control of society. That is what they are both terrified of. You heard what Irving Kristol said. I can't build socialism with these people. You heard what Susan Sontag said. Communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. They're both terrified, and they're both designed to hold off a genuine socialist mass movement. They fear you. They fear you standing up and getting involved in politics and asserting what you want. But you will, because history will mandate it. And the economic crisis will require you to do it. You are going to get involved in politics. You are going to demand jobs, healthcare, and education. You are going to assert your economic needs. You're going to do that. And we at the Center for Political Innovation, we are doing our best to make it happen. We are trying to build a movement demanding a government of action to fight for working families. And we are having our national convention in Portland on December 2nd. And you really ought to be there, because it is going to be quite a show. It is going to be quite a show. You won't regret it. So what you need to do is you need to register. If you're coming, I need you to register on the Eventbrite. And I can drop that link. I need you to register and attend. And if you can donate to help us do it, help us do the show, that would be even better, right? So if you're coming, please register. Please register. We need you there. We need to know how many people to expect, et cetera, how many packets to make, et cetera. We got to fill that auditorium, so we need to do lots of outreach, et cetera. So register. And if you understand how important our message is, and if you want to help us do this conference, if you see how unique this message is and how important it is, please support the conference. We're raising money. We got a lot of costs to take care of. Please support the conference. Please help us put on this important event and give people this unique understanding. Please support the conference. And on that note, folks, I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Micah in Las Vegas. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Names and locations. Names and locations. Randall Wilson in Lexington, Kentucky. Jonathan C. in Los Angeles. Names and locations. Names and location. Nick in St. Louis. Battle Cossack in Gonzalo. Balthazar in Oakland, Mima Flowers in California, Dan from Pasadena, California, John McCarthy in Chicago, Steve in Boston, Scott in Miami, John McCarthy in Chicago, Mob Daragon in St. Paul, Nico in San Diego, Meredith and Quinn in Washington State, Patrick in Maine, Bob Troy in New York, Moonlight Beach, California, Kirby from Chattanooga, Ian from England, Jamie from St. Paul, Robert Owen in Alex from Brazil, Corpus Christi, Corellia in Chicago, Randy from Trinidad, Saviero from Mexico, B from Cleveland. Welcome, B. Names and location. Briggy from Pennsylvania. Welcome, Briggy. Staying sane with CPI, the think tank for humanity. Yes, indeed. We are that. Anybody on the Rumble? Me in Canada says he's on the Rumble. Me in Canada. Very, very good. Anybody on the Rockfin? There's a lot happening on the Rockfin. But I don't see a location. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. All right. Any more names and locations? If not, I will start answering people's super chat questions. All righty. All right. Dark Dragonov says, when did the U.S. unions like the Teamsters become intertwined with efforts of corporatism. They no longer serve workers, but serve for-profit interests. Well, I wouldn't put it that way, right? That the labor union bureaucracy, right? And this is true. The leaders of the labor unions, they have a lot of money, right? They drive fancy cars, they wear suits, and in many cases, they restrain the workers. Right? The workers want to go out and fight, and they say, "Whoa, slow down, guys." However, their position as privileged union bureaucrats depends on the union existing. The higher the wages of the workers, the more dues money they get. And they're not capitalists, right? They are the leaders of the labor union bureaucracy. And so they have a dual nature. On the one hand, they advocate for the workers. They want the workers' wages to go up. They have a material interest in maintaining the union. But on the other hand, they're just interested in preserving their own position. They don't have a revolutionary ideology. They don't. And because they don't have a revolutionary ideology, they maintain the mindset that capitalism is necessary, that they just have to exist under capitalism. They just kind of want to carve out a position for themselves. Look, every major union contract begins, and this is pointed out, I did not know this, but you should go read High Tech, Low Pay by Sam Marcy. Every major union contract begins with the workers having to acknowledge the right of the capitalists to own the factory. Right? It says that capital and labor are both necessary. Right? The capitalist is just as essential as the worker. Every union contract, right, from the auto workers, steel workers, they all begin with that. Like the opening preamble always acknowledges that the capitalist is necessary. Well, the capitalist is not necessary. The workers can control the means of production, right? The workers can own their own plant, right? But there's a reason that that's in every union contract, and there's a reason that that's signed, right? All the labor union bosses sign that because they believe that, right? The head of the AFL-CIO, he believes that, right? Richard Trumka believes that. The head of the Teamsters Union, he believes that, right? And that the labor union bureaucracy, its ideology says that the capitalists are necessary. It says that they are just there to kind of represent the workers against the bosses and kind of a push and pull, and they have their own self-interest. And the labor union bureaucracy is a problem, and it's always been a problem. Business unionism has been a problem, etc. But the material interest is different, because the capitalist has no interest in seeing the wages of his employees go up. The less they get paid, the more he can make in profits. But the labor union bureaucrat, the more wages that are paid out, the more dues money he gets. So it's a dual role. And that the root of the problem of trade union bureaucracy is an ideological one, right? It's not that they're bad people. It's not that they're selfish and no, it's an ideological problem in its essence, right? If communists ran the labor unions, it would be a different story, right? And when communists ran the labor unions, you had the Flint sit-down strike, you had the San Francisco dock workers strike of 1934. When you had people running the labor unions who understood that the workers didn't need the bosses. The Wobblies, they used to chant, "We don't need the bosses need us. We don't need the bosses need us." Right? When you have that understanding, you're going to operate your labor union very, very differently. So I would say the problem is an ideological one. All right. Can you explain Lenin's new economic policy? I've heard it was not state capitalism and advanced for profits in command, not informed on it enough. Well, what happened was immediately after the Russian Revolution, they nationalized everything. The military took over the Red Army. They militarized the entire economy. It was called war communism. And they rationed the food in the military. Every man was drafted. The whole country was militarized. Then after that, they had said, what do we do next? And Lenin said, we have to have some free enterprise, right? And, to get the farms going again, some of these wealthy peasants who own their own land have got to start enriching themselves, right? And we got to have some private businesses, and we got to, in order to get the economy going again after the devastating war that had happened, that had killed millions of people, they needed to get the economy going again. But the commanding heights of the economy, the major industries like steel, the power plants, the lending of money, that will all remain nationalized. But they had what they called the NEP men, or the New Economic Policy men. And these were people that ran private businesses. And it was necessary, right? And it was a correct thing to do, right? That you, to some degree or other, they needed those farms to get going again. They didn't have tractors yet. They didn't have the capacity to build giant collective farms like they did later. And so they needed to that was a necessary step, and it was correct. The new economic policy was basically to get the economy going again after devastating war. They didn't have the resources to build up a state economy yet. That they had market policies. Trotsky was against it. Trotsky called for the continuing of military communism, and Bukharin and Zinoviev of the right opposition wanted to continue the new economic policy indefinitely. They said, we're just too poor to have socialism, so let's keep control of the major commanding heights, and let's just continue the new economic policy indefinitely. Stalin said, we don't have time. Right? They just didn't have time. Right? They were going to face a Nazi invasion. The capitalist economy was going to collapse. And if you read Stalin's writings, he was just saying, look, in theory, yes. Right? In theory, it would be okay if we were able to just do the free market thing but control it, right? Which is, that would be fine, but we don't have time. We just don't have time. We have to mobilize the population to go out and build and get ready for the Nazi invasion. In China, there is a feeling that the new economic policy should have been continued. And I mean, in theory, right, if a socialist country can do that, if a very, very poor socialist country can control the commanding heights but utilize the market in order to enrich the country, I think that's a good thing. But the Soviet Union was unique circumstances. They just didn't have the opportunity. They just didn't have the option of doing that. They had to very rapidly industrialize. So, but China was able to do that. They adopted new economic policy, market reforms in the 70s. And the United States was kind of courting them as an ally against the Soviet Union. So throughout the 1980s, they were able to just kind of keep bringing in foreign investment and controlling it. And honestly, I'm at the point that I think that some market mechanisms are necessary, right? The government shouldn't be running hotels. The government shouldn't be running restaurants. The government shouldn't be, making children's toys and clothing. The government should run the major industries, and all private industries should be controlled, right? There are mechanisms of imposing control over private industry with subsidies, with regulation, etc. Right? But I think yes, Bukharin and Zinoviev were correct in that ideally, if socialism is about maximizing wealth, you can't have the government run absolutely everything. You can't have the military run absolutely everything. And ideally, you want foreign investment, you want private markets, but you want a government of action that fights for working families and controls it, right? They were right, but the Soviet Union was in unique circumstances. They didn't have time for that, right? And Stalin was able to mobilize the population and do very amazing things during that time. But yeah, I do believe that what China did in the 70s and 80s is much more optimal, right? That what the Soviet Union had to do, which was very difficult, to mobilize that whole population. People worked 14-hour shifts in factories, and it was like, people were it was a heroic thing what they did, but it's not ideal, right? If you can develop socialism with a private market, that's better. But the Soviet Union didn't have that option. And a lot of communist countries didn't have that option because they were blockaded and they were surrounded. But, the private market shouldn't control the commanding heights. The private market is for things that make life fun, right? The private market's not for electricity. It's not for healthcare. It's not for housing. It's not for steel. It's for things that make life fun. It's for computer games. It's for movies. It's for shiny things, right? And this is how the USA was able to defeat the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviet Union could make steel very well. The Soviet Union could make computers very well. They designed their own home computer system without any Western technology, right? The Soviet Union, they could invent things. They could make steel. They made the AK-47 rifle, the most efficient weapon. They made LED lights. They could invent things and all of that. But when it came to things that made life enjoyable, like nice clothing, like like consumer goods, they weren't as good at it because people need to vote with their dollars on that kind of thing. You don't need to. I got electricity here in my house. Do I need to vote with my dollars on which electric company is going to give me the best service? No, right? No, right? The electricity comes on, right? And the people who work in the power plant, they're getting paid a wage. They go in, they work in the power plant to make sure I've got electricity in my home, and then they go home at the end of the night. Good. There's no need for the market in that. Steel, right? You need so much steel to for all kinds of things. Do the guys who make the steel mill, do they have to like go out of their way to like, how do we make the steel sexy? And no, they don't. You just need steel, right? The foundations of the economy, you don't need the market for, and they should be controlled by a central plan. It's just the fun stuff. It's the fun stuff, right? That's what you need the market for. But you have to control that market too. You subsidize it, right? Which, I mean, there's a lot of that even goes on in our economy. Do you think Netflix is a free market? Do you think Netflix is a free market? It's not. Netflix is technically private, but it's facilitated by the government. Susan Rice, who was from the Obama administration, is on the board. Obama and Michelle Obama own like a studio. And do you think it's free market? People vote, oh, I'm going to do No, Netflix has a political agenda, and Netflix is facilitated by the state. It's a virtual monopoly, but it's private. And that if you look at socialist countries like Huawei Technologies, technically a private company, makes a lot of money, but is the market dictating what Huawei does? No. The board of directors has a lot of generals on it. It gets government subsidies, and it produces, as a private company that uses market mechanisms and makes profits, it operates in accordance with the overall central plan. And if you look at socialist countries, that tends to be how they operate, is that if you have a local store, that store might go out of business if it doesn't make good products, or it might flourish if it makes good products. But really, the whole private sector, even though it's private and even though there's profits being made, it's still being controlled by the central planners. It's still being controlled by the central planners with subsidies. They all get a subsidy from the government. They all get, nudged to work certain ways. The government arranges for them to get a loan. I mean, if you look at it, and like Venezuela, right? Venezuela, very little is nationalized in Venezuela. The oil is nationalized, right? And oil is like the main commodity in Venezuela. They don't have government-run steel mills. They don't have, they don't have very much of a state sector at all. They have a huge private sector. But I would argue Venezuela is not a free market country, because that private sector in Venezuela all gets government regulations. And the government decides, we want to start producing this. And so it goes to a private company and it gives them lots of money in order to do it. Right? I mean, and if you look at that, right? And in Venezuela, a lot of the private sector in Venezuela are worker cooperatives, right? They have the colectivos in the socialist cities. And so you look at Venezuela, it's like you could say America's, if you think socialism means state ownership, you could say America is more socialist than Venezuela. I think we have a bigger state sector. Except in Venezuela, the state sector controls the private sector and dictates what the private sector does, right? And the revenue, the bulk of the revenue in the country is oil money that's coming in. And that oil money is used to control the private sector, to set up worker cooperatives, to subsidize private companies, and that's the difference between capitalism and socialism. Is what is dictating production? Are profits in command, or are the state central planners in command? And if you look at the Soviet Union during the new economic policy, right? The government ran the steel mills. There weren't very many of them yet. The government ran the power plants. Weren't very many of them yet. The government controlled the lending of money, which there was some. And there was a big private sector, private stores, private farmers. But the government was still in charge. There was still a state overall central plan. Right? It wasn't the Stalin 5-year plans yet, but it wasn't a free market. And China is not a free market. You don't have capitalism as Marx discussed it. Marx talked about how under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Marx talked about the anarchy of production, right? This is what Adam Smith talked about, the invisible hand. The market just makes shit happen because it's profitable. You don't have that in a socialist country. Even if that socialist country has a big private sector, you still don't have that. And you can have state capitalist countries like Saudi Arabia or Singapore, where there's a huge amount of government involvement, but you still have the invisible hand in charge, right? That's very clear in Saudi Arabia, right? The market dictates what happens in Saudi Arabia. Even though the government facilitates and everything is basically the property of the Saudi royal family, the Saudi royal family is operating to make profits, right? And they follow the market logic, all of that, all the invisible hand's all over Saudi Arabia. There's just a government middleman kind of interfering. But at the end of the day, the invisible hand drives Saudi Arabia. China, on the other hand, not as much state ownership as Saudi Arabia, but the state is in charge. The state controls the market, and the invisible hand, to whatever degree it operates, is completely controlled by the state. That's the difference. The anarchy of production, the chaos of the market, the preliminary transformation into capital that drives production versus the central plan and the overall vision for growth, right? That is the difference between capitalism and socialism. And so many people do not get it. Frederick Engels talks about production upon a predetermined plan. Karl Marx, he talks about the centralization of the instruments of production into the hands of the state, meaning not that they're all necessarily government owned, but they're all they're centralized in how they're operated. They don't just do whatever happens to be profitable. There is a central plan and what does the central plan do? To raise the level of abundance, right? In order that growth is no longer held back by the market, you have a central plan. That is the essence of socialism. Socialism is negating the anarchy of production. All right. Is bowing to spontaneity the same as tailism? And who used this first? Well, both of these terms, my understanding is that they come from What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin. But they refer to two slightly different things, okay? So bowing to spontaneity is that if there is a spontaneous uprising among the population, you don't interfere with it, or you just chase after it, or you just go with it. You don't interfere. You don't try to direct it in a certain way. You just spontaneity. You just bow to spontaneity. Oh, it's happening, so we'll go with it. All right, that's bowing to spontaneity. Tailism is that rather than offering leadership, you follow, right? The idea is revolutionaries are supposed to be leading. They're supposed to be telling people something they don't know, pushing them to do things they wouldn't normally do. Tailism is the opposite. People are already doing something, and you're running behind them going, oh, yeah, you should do that, and we're communists, and we do that too. Bowing to spontaneity is just going along with whatever is spontaneously happening among the masses. Tailism is running behind whatever's happening among the masses, and instead of offering communist leadership, you are just tailoring your political message to follow after whatever the people already believe. And basically, Lenin's critique of both bowing to spontaneity and tailism, used in the book What Is to Be Done, is that you should be telling the people something they don't know. Right? You should be offering leadership, because spontaneity by itself will just lead naturally back into leaders of the old system. That's what he's arguing, that a spontaneous uprising left to its own devices will just get co-opted by the leaders of the old system. That it's necessary, when a spontaneous uprising comes, that the revolutionaries must go there and direct it in a revolutionary way. And if they don't direct it in a revolutionary way, then it just gets absorbed into the old system. Right? That's what he's getting at. If you read What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin, which is a very important theoretical book, but it is very, very difficult to read. It is not an easy book to read, because it's got all kinds of references to old Russian newspapers in it, and it's got all kinds of, it is some archaic, esoteric shit, but it's really, really, really important. So there you go. Why some leftists love Cuba but hate DPRK, and why hasn't a voting at the UN about ending the sanctions on the DPRK? Okay, so first thing, why do some leftists love Cuba but hate the DPRK? Cultural. I mean, it's that simple, right? Cuban culture is a lot more like American culture, right? Right? Cubans, they drink rum, they go on the beach, they listen to salsa music. They're culturally much closer to Americans. We have a lot of Latinos in America, right? We have a lot of African American folks in America. Cuban culture is a lot more similar to our culture, right? It's very close geographically. Whereas Korean culture, traditional Korean culture, which has largely been eroded in South Korea, which is very interesting. North Korea is much more traditionally Korean than South Korea, right? North Korea and their culture there is very Confucian, right? And there's a lot of, for example, in North Korea, and they probably used to do this in South Korea. They don't do it anymore. But in North Korea, if you're a teacher, on your birthday, your students all bring you a present on your birthday. And they bring you a birthday present, and they all give a speech to you about how much they love you being their teacher, and they give you a present. We don't do that in America, but that's very Confucian, right? In Confucian tradition, the teacher, the people's obligation to authority is a really big, important thing, right? And that North Korea is not as Americanized as South Korea. And it has they've preserved a lot more of the Confucian traditional Korean culture. Okay? Whereas Cuba is culturally a lot like the United States. So I think that's the issue, right? In South Korea, right? If you work at a car company in South Korea, and this is true, right? There's a car company in South Korea, Hyundai or whatever. And in the offices, they have a big picture of the guy who started the car company. And there's a cult of personality around the dude who started the car company, right? In South Korea, right? There's a lot of aspects of North Korea that the West demonizes, the worship of dear leader, the militarism, and that's just traditional Confucian culture. And because they've been cut off by the United States, the USA has just cut them off. American culture hasn't flowed in there. So the traditional Korean culture that's very Confucian is still well intact. Whereas in South Korea, they've been very Americanized. And so it's not as pronounced, but it's still there. It's still there. There's still a lot of Confucian stuff in South Korea. There's still a lot of traditional authoritarian stuff, but it's different. So I would say these are cultural differences. That's one, right? There's another factor too, and this is you can't ignore this factor. Democrats like Cuba, Republicans like North Korea, and that is so stupid, right? I mean, at the end of the day, Democrats don't really like Cuba, and Republicans don't really like North Korea. But this is kind of how American politics is getting, is that among dissident countries, the ruling parties of the United States divide. All right? Right? Republicans love Israel and don't want to negotiate with Iran. Democrats want to negotiate with Iran and are slightly more critical of Israel, but not really. Right? Democrats are a little more friendly to China, but hate Russia. Republicans are a little more friendly to China, but really hate, or a little more friendly to Russia, but hate China. Right? Democrats very much have been the party that, it's mainly because in Miami, there is a crowd, there's a really, really strong, they call it the Gusano lobby or the Miami lobby. The most anti-Cuban forces in the United States are the people who fled Cuba after the revolution. And they're all Republicans. Right? Marco Rubio, etc. So the Democrats, they don't like them. And so they're slightly more sympathetic to Cuba. Right? Obama established diplomatic relations with Cuba, went to Cuba. And so because of that, Democrats like Cuba. However, it's Republicans. Donald Trump went to North Korea, met with Kim Jong-un. So for whatever reason, it's like a division of labor. Republicans pretend to be North Korea's friend and pretend to be Russia's friend when they actually, the majority of them, they don't do much to help them, right? I mean, Donald Trump ripped up nuclear treaties with Russia. Donald Trump, he wasn't able to finish the job with Kim Jong-un. They had a couple meetings and then it didn't go anyplace, right? So, but Republicans at least talk like they're friendlier to Russia, they're friendlier to North Korea. Democrats talk like they're friendlier to Cuba and they're friendlier to China. But at the end of the day, they're not really friendly to both of them because it's still the American ruling class, right? So that's part of it too. Now, the second part of your question is why hasn't there been voting at the UN to end the sanctions on North Korea? For this reason, and this reason alone, right? I mean, this is the main reason, is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, right? It's been signed. There's this thing called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that basically every country that signs it, if they don't have nukes, they can't get them. And you can't help a country get them, right? It's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty says every country that signed it, if you don't have nukes already, you cannot acquire nukes. And no other country can help you acquire nukes, right? That's the idea, right? And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is good for the United States. It's good for Russia. It's good for China. Because before the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty came along, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the United States helped South Africa to get nuclear weapons. And, the USA, without the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, could go to all of its allies and give them nukes, which would then obligate Russia and China to go to all of their allies and give them nukes. And then pretty soon, every country in the world's got nuclear bombs. Russia doesn't want that to happen. China doesn't want that to happen. The United States doesn't want that to happen. They don't want every country in the world to have nukes. So they have this thing called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that the bulk of the world has signed. Israel has not signed it. But the bulk of the world has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is if you don't have nukes now, you can't acquire them. The countries that already have them are not allowed to help other people get them. That's how the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty works. North Korea signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but then North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and acquired nuclear weapons. And the reason that at the UN you have not seen, Russia and China and all of them just remove the sanctions from North Korea is because to do so would be saying that, in effect, saying you're allowed to leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which some people read the text as saying you are allowed to do that. But regardless, Russia and China don't want countries leaving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They don't want every U.S.-aligned country to just say, oh, I guess we're going to get nukes now. We're leaving the treaty. Because then all of their allies, and pretty soon we got nukes all over the world. It's about maintaining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's what it's about, okay? North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Russia and China are obligated. They want the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to remain intact. So because of that, it is their obligation to maintain sanctions on North Korea for violating and withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. My belief is that North Korea will, at some point in the future, give up their nukes and rejoin the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And at that point, all the UN sanctions will be lifted. And the only sanctions left on North Korea will be the unilateral sanctions from the United States. North Korea will be able to join the BRICS, etc. But in order for North Korea to be in a position to give up their nukes, they have to have absolute security. So there you go. That's my take on that, is that North Korea, in order to stay in the nuclear that's the issue there. Little known fact that nobody talks about. South Korea did not sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for a long time. And even after they signed it, they still maintained a secret nuclear program. Park Chung-hee, the military dictator of South Korea, ran a nuclear weapons program in South Korea for a really long time. And Jimmy Carter and the French government and all of NATO started going after South Korea, because if South Korea had gotten its own nuclear weapons, then North Korea would not be a threat to them anymore, and there would be then the removal of U.S. troops. They wouldn't need the U.S. troops there anymore. And the whole Western world did everything they could to prevent South Korea from getting their own nukes. They forced South Korea to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then South Korea was caught basically violating it. They had a secret nuclear program up into the 80s, trying to get nukes in violation of the treaty, and they made a special deal so it wasn't considered a violation. But South Korea tried to get nukes long before North Korea ever had them, and no one talks about that now. That's just been swept under the rug. That's ancient history. And that while South Korea was trying to acquire its own nuclear weapons, the Carter administration launched Koreagate. And read about Koreagate. The Carter administration basically went to war against South Korean politicians and South Korean businesses in America, Tongson Park and others. There was a whole campaign against South Korea by the Carter administration because South Korea was trying to get nukes. And they jailed South Korean businessmen, and it was a whole public relations thing. They demonized people. Read about Koreagate. And the dictator of South Korea, Park Chung-hee, died under very mysterious circumstances. 1979, Park Chung-hee was having dinner with the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, and the head of the KCIA killed him. And then the KCIA killed the head of the KCIA. And we don't know why. He never got to state his motives before he was killed. Could you imagine that? That'd be like the president of the United States having dinner with the head of the CIA, and in the middle of the dinner, the head of the CIA kills him, and then the rest of the CIA kills the head of the CIA, so no one knows what happened. Right? It's really shady, and it really looks to most people like Jimmy Carter killed Park Chung-hee. The U.S. CIA killed Park Chung-hee. Right? It really looks like that because Park Chung-hee wanted South Korea to have its own nukes. And that would have led to U.S. troops leaving the Korean Peninsula. And it would have led to an independent, strong South Korea. And it probably would have led to South Korea and North Korea negotiating the terms of reuniting. And the USA wasn't going to have that, right? Even though Park Chung-hee was a brutal dictator who killed a lot of communists, he was economically independent. And he was building up the state-run industries of South Korea and the military economy. And he would have realized that, hey, North Korea's got the Soviet Union there, and he probably would have negotiated not only the withdrawal of U.S. troops because he had nukes, he probably would have negotiated the opening up of trade between North and South Korea and would have moved toward peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And that doesn't fit the narrative at all, right? Again, Park Chung-hee was a vicious anti-communist, an extreme anti-communist, right? Fascist. I don't think he's a fascist. I think fascist is a first world thing, but he was a right-wing military dictator, but he was independent. He was a Bonapartist, and he just trying to work in his own economic interest. And if he had gotten nukes for South Korea and the U.S. troops had left and he had continued with his economic development projects, I think we may have a unified Korea right now, right? We may have had peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and we may have a joint government in Korea where the Korean Workers' Party runs the North, Park Chung-hee runs the South, and they're super economically prosperous and doing business with Russia and China. And again, I'm doing a hypothetical. You never know, but it really looks like the Carter administration assassinated Park Chung-hee. That's what it looks like, and that's fascinating. But that points to, and this is a point I made last night. I made this point last night, and I'm going to make it again. Stop thinking about the world in terms of good people and bad people. That is kindergarten stuff. Let me repeat. Stop thinking about the world in terms of good people and bad people. Right? People in politics play different roles under different circumstances. And so many people that I encounter, especially now in the age of social media, they think that the way to understand politics is that there's the good people and there's the bad people. So I have to condemn the bad people and I have to show everybody I'm one of the good people. That is not politics. Politics is not supposed to be about virtue signaling and proving to everyone you're good. Politics is about getting good things done. It is about making people's lives better. It is about accomplishing things. And accomplishing things means that there are people that you might be able to work with today who you can't work with tomorrow. And that you might be able to work with tomorrow and you can't work with today. And that is what people need to understand. Look, right now, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK are playing a very bad role. I cannot tweet them out. I cannot share their videos. That would be a slap in the face to the Palestinians. I can't do it. But I'm not ashamed of the fact that when they were playing a better role, I promoted them. And they might play a better role again. I don't know, right? And that I really, really, really wish. I really, really, really wish people could understand this, right? My promoting of Tulsi Gabbard was not because I thought in her soul she was a good person. And my disagreement with her now is not because I think in her soul she's a bad person. I think she's a person in the political power structure who was playing a very good role for some time, who is now, in light of everything that's gone down in Gaza, she's playing a very negative role. The stuff she's saying about Iran and all of that, she's off base. But that could change. Maybe at some point she'll play a better role again. I don't know. But you cannot view relationships in politics, alliances, based on who's good and who's bad. Okay? Right? I mean, the American Revolution, they got support from France. They got support from France. Did that mean, do you think the founding fathers were monarchists? Do you think they were Roman Catholics? Of course not. But the French were against the British. Right? And it annoys me. There's a certain strand of politics out there. They're like conspiratorial. And they sit there and it's like there's a vast conspiracy and I'm against it. And then they discover that somebody talked to somebody or somebody somewhere. And pretty soon, it's like the amount of people they can be friends with is just constantly going down because everyone turns out to somehow be part of the conspiracy. This is pathetic childishness. You know, I've been to a number of funerals in my life. I have never yet been to a funeral like this, where the minister gets up there. Oh, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to remember John. And you know, John didn't live a very interesting life. He didn't really do much, but we all love John. We'll miss John dearly because there was that one day where John was right on the internet. John was right. It was 2 a.m. and he was pounding away at his keyboard and he was right on the internet. And everyone else was wrong. He was right on the internet. He knew somebody was a phony. He knew somebody was a fraud. He knew somebody was a fake and was no good. And he was pounding upon his keyboard and he was right. And he was all alone in his apartment and he was pounding on his keyboard and he was right. He was right. And the other people on the internet were wrong. And for this, we will always remember John, the great, great man who was right upon the internet. No one's ever been to a funeral like that. And I just want to shake these people. I really want to shake these people. Okay? I really want to shake them because they just don't care. Right? It's like it never occurs to them that you could actually change anything. You could actually build an anti-war movement. You could change the way people think. You could influence U.S. society. No. All that they ever want to accomplish in their goddamn life is being right on the internet. The world consists of good people and bad people, and they're one of the good people. And for a while, they were friends with somebody, but no, that person, they found an old tweet they made. They was one of the bad people. Well, I denounced them. I'm one of the good people, I am. This guy's one of the bad people. This is childishness. This is the height of childishness. It's idiocy. It's pure idiocy. Right? It's pure idiocy. Pure idiocy. Right? I showed this clip on my stream earlier today. It very much applies. This is what they are. Okay? This is what they are. It is this great moment in American television.
Hey, look at me, Chris. I'm Yanni, sends the attitude.
My God, that's amazing. You are so talented.
Huh?
Wait a second. Something's not right here. You were just making it look like you were playing. You're a phony. Hey, this guy's a great big phony.
Come on, Chris. Ah! Oh, there you are, Stewie.
Hey, you're a great big phony, you know that?
Hey, come on, Stewie. Your mom and I have something for you.
Give it to me! Give it to me now, damn it!
Not now, Stewie, when we get home.
That's right. You're a big fat phony!
Look, just because you're repulsive and probably the most annoying person on the planet, and I'm not the only person who thinks so, that doesn't mean I want you to go and kill yourself.
Thanks, Meg. But I was never really planning to jump.
Wasn't gonna jump. You're a phony! Hey, everybody! This guy's a great big phony!
Yeah. That's what we're dealing with here. That's what we're dealing with here. This is like the level of idiocy, right? The fact that Tulsi Gabbard was part of the American state apparatus that for whatever reason, probably related to circumstances in her own life, probably also related to divisions in the deep state. Look, a big factor, Michael Flynn, for example. Michael Flynn, his motivation, he always has felt that we should get along with Russia better because Russia fights Islamic terrorists, right? Russia's been fighting the Al-Qaeda types very effectively, and it can provide very good intelligence about the Al-Qaeda types. And, Russia warned America about the Tsarnaev brothers who blew up the Boston Marathon, and the American government didn't listen. But, Russia has been tracking Islamic terrorists and has been doing so very effectively for a long time. And Michael Flynn and people like him in the Pentagon, they're not communists, they're not anti-imperialists, but they want to get along with Russia because they want Russia to cooperate with them around intelligence to fight terrorist groups. And they're more concerned about that than they are with fighting Russia and geopolitical whatever. They don't care about that. They just want to fight terrorists. Well, that mindset, they also see Hamas as terrorists. They also see Israel as an ally fighting terrorism. So when it comes to the Israel-Palestine thing, they're going to be completely wrong. Now, I'm not sure that's necessarily where Tulsi Gabbard is at, but, that's where Michael Flynn is at, right? There are, and that's the thing. I mean, do you think the Communist Party of the United States supported Roosevelt because they thought deep in his soul Roosevelt was a good man? No. It was a tactic. There was a division in the ruling class. There was one section of the ruling class that wanted to be friendlier to the Soviet Union and was anti-fascist, and they aligned with Roosevelt. It was a tactic, right? And that, if you just sit there and it's this game of who are the good people, who are the bad people, I'm going to expose the bad people. I mean, it's just so sad. Again, we shall all remember the day that Dude Bro Steve was right upon the internet. Everyone else was not right. But he had the screenshot. He had the screenshot in his brilliance. He had the screenshot. He had the proof that everyone else was no good. We shall all remember this great individual, Steve the Dude Bro, because he had the screenshot to prove that somebody who was doing something good was actually not good. We shall all honor him. We shall all honor him. I mean, this is what we're dealing with, and it's really, really annoying. It's really, really annoying. I hope Tulsi Gabbard plays a better role again in the future because she's already somebody who's aware of me and listens to my stuff. So my hope is that she will drift in a better direction. But now she has drifted in a very bad direction. There you go. I mean, what more is there to say about it, right? And I mean, the same with RFK. I thought RFK despite, whatever, he was playing a pretty good role, but now he's playing a very bad role. But I hope that, again, who knows what could happen. I hope he changes his mind. I hope he drifts, but, it's not about sitting there and determining. It's not like there's these people, they think there's like a vast conspiracy. There's the good people, and then there's the vast evil conspiracy. And then this person came along and they thought they were good, but they were actually part of the vast evil conspiracy. That's not how this works. There are different power structures, there's different interests, and we're trying to maneuver and strategically build up for what we know to be right. We're trying to change the world. That's what we're trying to do. And I just wish people could understand it from this point of view and not think about it in this kind of juvenile moralistic way. And, some people are capable of doing that, and some people just want to sit on the internet and be right. So if your goal in life is to sit on the internet and be right, I take my hat off to you. When RFK talks about using the tax code to prevent BlackRock from buying up single-family homes, would that be a kind of socialism? No, that would be regulation of capitalism, right? I mean, it would be state regulation of capitalism. BlackRock would still be existing as a market institution, functioning according to its profit interests, but there would be a regulation imposed to prevent it from doing certain things, right? It would be a regulation of capitalism intended to alleviate some of its negative effects, just like the post office, just like food stamps, etc., just like antitrust legislation. It's probably a good idea. I didn't realize RFK talked about that. Again, RFK, these people play mixed roles. Look, Roosevelt did Japanese internment. Did that make Hitler right in World War II? Did that mean we shouldn't have supported Russia in the fight against the Nazis because Roosevelt did Japanese internment? Did the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki make World War II, equal? Did it make World War II six one way, half a dozen the other? Of course not. There are problems, okay? There are problems on all sides, and we have to be realistic about this. Do you want to actually accomplish anything? Or do you just want to sit on the internet and be morally pure? You're above it all, right? There in 1864, Karl Marx endorsed Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election. And Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. But there was another candidate who wasn't a Democrat, who was from what was called the Radical Democrat Party, the Free Soilers. And that Free Soiler candidate was far closer to the views of Marx than Lincoln was. Did you know this? Right. I mean, he could have endorsed that guy, but instead he endorsed Lincoln because Lincoln had a chance of winning. And if Lincoln lost the 1864 election, the Civil War would have ended. There would have been a peace treaty with the South. The South would have kept slavery. Lincoln had to get reelected. Don't change horses midstream. And Karl Marx didn't endorse the Free Soiler. He endorsed Lincoln because Lincoln was the guy who would finish the Civil War. So there you go. All right, folks. I am going to put on the closing music, but I'll be back probably tomorrow, probably at noon. We shall see. We shall see. In the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.